Hope you had a relatively relaxing and restful afternoon. And if you didn't, that it was by your choice and not by somebody else's. Some of us don't have that luxury, but thankful either way for you being here and for you making a point to worship with brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, if people are familiar with the nation of Israel, more than likely they are familiar with the kingship of Israel. And if they are familiar with the kingship and the kingdom of Israel, more than likely they are familiar with King David. And we're going to spend this month, the rest of this month, looking at King David on Sunday night. In particular, we're going to be looking at his strength. At different moments in his life, we're going to be taking note of the strength of David. Sounds like a children's book. If you give a mouse a cookie, then this. If they are familiar with King David, more than likely they are familiar with one event in particular in his life. David and Goliath. Bathsheba's next week. David and Goliath. David and Goliath. So that's what we're looking at this evening. And I guess we'll look at David and Bathsheba next week. So tune in next week and we'll look at that. But let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, because here we see the story of David and Goliath. Each week we're going to look at, because we have a lot of different strengths, right? I remember being fascinated. There's this fella that grew up in a tiny little town that I grew up in called Sharp, Kentucky, just south of Possum Trot, Kentucky, if you're interested. And this guy, Galen Goff, he toured, he was in part of the war, World War II, but he toured the country doing these physical feats of strength. And I love looking at some of the things that he did. And he took a phone book and he ripped it in two. How is someone able to? I was fascinated with that. And I saw pictures of him pulling a car, a truck, I think it was, with his teeth. Like, man, that's gotta hurt. You know, all these physical feats. And physical strength, when we think about strength, that's probably what we're thinking of is physical strength, how they are strong physically, and that's what we're looking at tonight, the physical strength of David. David and Goliath. What a demonstration of physical strength. Here stands a man, head and shoulders, elbows, head and shoulders above the rest of humanity, it seems like at this point. And he comes out to defy the armies of the living God. Here comes a little ruddy, handsome boy, a little shepherd. And he stands in front of this giant. So let's look at some things that we can learn here in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we're going to read a lot of these verses. We're going to actually read several passages, and then there's going to be some inferences as to how David drew strength. And the first one I'm going to look at is in beginning of verse 31. Read with me, beginning of verse 31. Look at the physical strength of David, where he drew physical strength. When the words that David spoke were heard, he comes to his brothers, bringing them some food. When the words of David were heard, they repeated them before King Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. One avenue from which David drew physical strength was from his past. His past. David remembered killing the lion. David remembered killing the bear. And he says, this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. So we read verses 31 through 37, and we see that David is this picture of strength. Now here he's coming to help, right? To bring aid to his brothers, his older brothers, his three, if I remember correctly, his three older brothers. He's the youngest. And yet, in many ways, he demonstrates more courage and bravery and strength than his older brothers. Isn't that fascinating? Because of what has happened in his past. He looks back on killing the lion, he looks back on killing the bear, and he says, I can do this. I mean, I'm not scared of a lion, I'm not scared of a bear. And when I killed them, and if I didn't kill them the first time and they rose, and I just made them mad and they rose up against me, I grabbed them by the beard and I struck them and I killed them. Now, there's a lot of things in the wild that I'm not going to mess with. I don't mess around very much with snakes. If I can tell that they're not poisonous, I'll allow them to live a little bit longer until they run across somebody else. But by George, I will never mess with a bear. Not without a gun. From a very, very, very long distance. And I will never mess with a lion. Again, unless it's from the safety of a vehicle from a very long way away. But this guy, this little boy, this little shepherd, little teenager with his audacity, right? He says, I've killed the lion and I've killed the bear, and I grabbed him by the beard and I struck him. If I can do that, surely I could do this guy. You see, David, he drew strength from the events of the past, where he knows that, hey, God was with me. I mean, God delivered me from the bear, God delivered me from the lion, and God's going to deliver me from this Philistine. So he drew strength from the events of the past. And in the same way, I don't know about you, but I see how God has worked in my life. I see how God has acted in my life. And there is no doubt that I draw strength from the past. It's not that God has always protected me and that God has always, allowed me the safest and the cleanest path to where I am today. That's not the case at all. Or that God has kept me from making mistakes. Absolutely not. But I see how God has led me. I see where God has put me. And I'm stronger today because of my past. Don't you agree? Don't you agree that we draw strength from the past? Every time I read this passage, I am thoroughly comforted. In Isaiah chapter 43, in verse 2, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. How encouraging is that? How awesome is it to know that no matter what, God remains the same. Now look at it. He's not saying, hey, you're never going to go through the floods. You're never going to go through the waters. You're never going to have to go through the fire. You're never going to have to travel through the desert. That's not what he says at all, is it? It's not that you're not going to go through those things. It's not that in life you're not going to experience those things. But when you do experience those things, when you do go through the fire, I will be with you. Travel with me very quickly in chapter 43 in Isaiah. You see, in verse 1, he says, fear not. And then after he says, fear not, he goes into when you pass through the waters, through the rivers, when you walk through fire, right? Fear not is the preface. And then at the end of that, in verse 5, again, he says, fear not, for I am with you. The first time he says, fear not, for I have redeemed you. The second time he says, fear not, for I am with you. We can draw strength from our past, looking at how God has redeemed us. I mean, I wasn't the best guy, but God has bought me. He has redeemed me. I haven't been in the best situations. I haven't made the best choices, but God has never left me. God has never forsaken me. And this is my favorite part of this chapter, because over and over and over again, the reassurance isn't that you're not going to walk through the fire. It's not that you're going to not go through the flood waters or anything like that, but it is, I am the Lord. You can draw strength and comfort because I am the Lord. Look at this in verse 3. For I am the Lord. Again in verse 11, I am the Lord, and besides me there is no other. Verse 10, I am He. Verse 12, I am God. Verse 13, I am He. Verse 15, I am the Lord. I am He. Verse 25, I am the Lord. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. So we can draw strength from the past because we see how God, the Lord, has worked, how He has been with us. I know Paul certainly experienced that in his life. One of the final words, as far as we are concerned, that Paul wrote, that's recorded for us in our New Testaments, in 2 Timothy, in chapter 4, this is what he says there in verse 18. Paul, he is near, many assume that he is near death, that he is facing what would ultimately be his execution. And this is what he writes. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into His heavenly kingdom. To Him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Some of the last words that Paul perhaps ever wrote. The Lord will deliver me. If our history is correct, shortly after that, Paul is beheaded. But you know what? Paul still believed that the Lord will deliver him. And you know why? Because God always delivered him. He drew strength from the past. And I promise you, God did deliver him from this world and from every evil deed. We can draw strength from the past just as David did. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. We also see that David drew strength from his abilities, okay? David drew strength and he grew stronger because he relied on his abilities, okay? Bear with me. Look at verse 38, and we're going to read through verse 40. Then Saul, after hearing this, Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's pouch, his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Something fascinating in that story to me. Because he had the option, right? He had the option of this armor and the protection. He had the option to be fully clothed and defend all of his vital organs. It's like, nah, I don't really need those. I'm telling you, if I'm looking at a 9 foot, perhaps 9 foot, over 9 foot giant, I'm going to wear a helmet. and I'm probably going to carry a shield and a sword. But David, he put them off. And I'm sure, here's this little teenage boy. And Saul, you remember how tall Saul was? He was a head and shoulders above everybody else. I'm sure his armor was perfectly fitted for himself. And here comes this little ruddy teenager. And he's like, yeah, I can't fit into that. It's kind of pointless for me. But what he did is he relied on his past abilities. Now, it doesn't tell us this, but I've often wondered, did he kill a lion and a bear with a slingshot? Perhaps, right? Maybe. But that's what he was comfortable with. And that's what he used. He didn't have to have the shiniest and the best. He just used what he had and what he was comfortable with. So he goes with what? A stick called a staff, a leather pouch called a sling, and 5 rocks. That's what he had. That's what he was comfortable with. A lot of times, what we do is we get caught up in what we don't have. And we think, if I just had fill in the blank, then I could do fill in the blank. Or if we were just blessed with, talking as a congregation, if we were just blessed with this, and then fill in the blank would be so much better. Here it is. You don't. I don't. We don't have fill in the blank. Use what you have. Use what you have been given and let God do the rest. I mean, David didn't need a sword, did he? He used Goliath's sword. David didn't need a coat of mail. Goliath never even got off a shot. He didn't need all those things. He used his abilities. He used what he had and what he was comfortable with, and he let God take care of the rest. I don't know about you, but it reminds me personally, it reminds me of Matthew chapter 25. Because in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus, in the final year of his ministry, he tells this parable about talents. You remember, we're talking about money. We're talking about a significant sum of money. He said one's got 5. The master goes away on a trip. He gives one 5, he gives one 2, and he gives one 1. The one with 5, he doubles his. The one with 2, he doubles his when the master comes back. And the one with 1, he goes and buries his. Which to me, I'm saving, and that's a logical conclusion. I'm going to protect this. Throughout history, we're talking about money, but throughout history, and I think it's probably pretty accurate. The correlation is to our talents, our abilities. It's been made. But how true is that? If you use your abilities, isn't God going to reward you for using them? But if you bury your abilities, what good is it? Might as well take it away because you're not using it. You don't have to have fill in the blank type of ability. But you do have to use what you've been given. Use it or lose it. I mean, that's the gist of the parable, isn't it? Use the talent, invest it, and make more, or lose it. We're not all required to be something we're not. We're not required to do something that we can't. That's not what God asks us to do. He just asks us, like David, you're a shepherd boy. Don't pretend to be a soldier. Go out with your rocks, go out with your stick, and kill a giant. I mean, it may be a tall ask. Which leads us to point number 3. He drew strength not from the rocks and not from the sling and not from his past history. I think his greatest source of strength came from the Lord. I think that the greatest source of comfort and strength and courage, it came from what he says in verses 41 through 47. Read this. David, after this conversation with Saul, he goes out to the brook where the Philistine had been for over a month, calling out to the army. And the Philistine, in verse 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He hated him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come out to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." And then David replies in only a way that a audacious, arrogant, little teenage boy would reply, staring at a 9-foot giant. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistine this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Get him, David. I mean, you can imagine the rest of the army of the Israelites who have cowarded away from this Philistine, kind of supporting him from a distance. Go get him, David. Right? But here comes this little audacious teenager, and he says, "I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you today, and everybody's going to know that God delivered you into my hands." If you mark in your Bible, mark this repetition. You see in verse 26, a repeating phrase beginning in verse 26. This is when David first comes up to the army, to the battle line, and begins to, he hears of Goliath. Look at what he says in verse 26. "And David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine,'" here it is, "'that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" David says that to the soldiers. And if you remember, we've already read it, but look at what David says to King Saul in verse 36. "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And now, facing this giant, look at what he says. "The God of the armies," and this is verse 45, "the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." I'm going to kill you because you have defied the Lord. 3 different times, 3 different people. The repetition and the saying is the same. You have defied the armies of the Lord, right? And God is going to deliver you. It says, we just read in these 6 verses, it says in these verses, in the ESV, it's broken up into 4 different sentences. And in these 4 sentences, God or the Lord is mentioned 6 different times. You see, David, he wasn't really concerned about the reproach of his brothers. He wasn't really concerned about the reproach of the king, nor was he necessarily even concerned about the reproach on himself for being an Israelite. What he was concerned with is, you have defied the armies of God. You've defied the Lord. And today we're going to see God win. As he concludes his manifesto to the Philistine, In verse 46 and verse 47, he says 3 things. After I win, there are going to be 3 things that are going to be known all over. The first thing in verse 46, let's read it. He says this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Everybody's going to know that God lives. Everyone is going to know that there is a God who lives today in Israel. He ain't dead. He's working. Verse 47, the beginning of verse 47, it says, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear. The Lord saves. The first, he says, the Lord lives, the Lord is alive, and the Lord is going to deliver you over to me, and the Lord saves. But he doesn't save in the way that you might think. Because if he saves in the way that you might think, I would need a spear, right? I would need a sword. I would need a helmet. I would need this coat of mail. I would need all those things. But the Lord saves. Maybe not in the way that we think, but God does save. And he ends verse 47, our text, he says, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. God wins. After I beat you, Goliath, everyone will know that there is a God in Israel, that God is alive, and that God saves his people, and God will win every single time. Physical strength. The physical strength of this little shepherd boy was drawn from the Lord to which he served. The strength of this boy who has been ordained king is from God. I don't know about you, but I'm not strong enough to go through life without God. I don't know how anybody could face the word cancer without God. I don't know how anybody could be called into a doctor's office and hear the words, there is no hope, without God. I don't know how anybody could go to a delivery room or operating room without God. God is our strength. But sometimes when we move away from God, our strength begins to fail. If your strength is failing, if you need to be rejuvenated and revived through the strength of the Lord, I want to invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.